This is a short overview of the life of Pope John the 23rd, who was our significant person that we study for Christianity. So when we're looking at Pope John the 23rd, just as a general point, when we're writing about him, and we write about Pope John in the essay as one of the key figures in our essay, what we need to do is we can write Pope John as it's written here, Pope John, and then the Roman numerals for 23. But after that, we can just shorten that to PJ and the Roman numerals for 23, and that'll save a lot of time in the writing. So when we look at Pope John, we'll have a look firstly at the syllabus dot points. So these are the syllabus dot points for Pope John. On the left here, we've got the significant people and ideas, and the one we've chosen to do is the contribution to Christianity of Pope John the 23rd. So just to make a few points about these dot points, what we're looking for is contribution. So when we're looking at contribution, we want to look at the impact he's had and the way things that he may have changed. And what it's important to remember is that even though Pope John the 23rd is the head of the Catholic Church, we don't talk specifically about Catholics, so that's not our focus. We want to focus on Christianity. So when we're talking about Pope John the 23rd, we're talking about Pope John the 23rd as a leading as a leading Christian figure, and the impact he had on all Christians and in fact all people. So that's our focus. We don't sort of narrow it to the Catholic viewpoint. We need to be a bit broader than that, because this is studies of religion, not Catholic studies. So over here on the other side, we've got to explain the contribution to the development and expression of Christianity by Pope John the 23rd. So we've got the contribution is what impact he's made, into the development and the expression. So the development is the way we've seen things progress over time, and the expression is the way that adherents express their faith. And we've got examples for both of those, but we need to be able to use this language. And the explain here means we've got to make linkages we've got to make links when we're talking about these things. We have to show how one leads to another, or cause and effect, and those sorts of things. Analyze the impact of this person or school of thought on Christianity. So we need to talk about impact. It's the key word there. How important was it? How much did things change? So essentially, when we're analysing the impact, we need to be able to make key points about the actual, how much, I suppose, is one way of putting it. How much did he actually change things? So that's the way we sort of focus on the syllabus dot points. So as a bit of an overview, here's from the Times. I think it was 1961. It might have been. I can't read it from here, but Pope John was Times Man of the Year, which is a pretty massive achievement. What we need to look at when we're looking at Pope John is we kind of break it up into a few different areas that we focus on. But essentially, when we're looking at Pope John, he revolutionised the role of the Pope, the way the Pope was seen around the world, what the Pope did, and he's essentially created a model for the papacy that has been followed by his predecessors. So as it says, he formed the archetype for the modern papacy. He only had a 4-year tenure. He was intended to be an interim pope because he was already quite old. So he was put in there as a caretaker pope, so to speak. So he was there to just fill in until another candidate came along. So it wasn't expected to be a big to cause many changes or to have much of an impact. His papacy was supposed to be just a short-term, low-impact sort of thing. So during his 4-year tenure, the media dubbed him Good Pope John and the People's Pope, and we'll see why in some of these later activities, later comments. And he also changed the redundant system of Christianity into a revolutionised body of alliance. So what he did was he just changed the way that people worshipped and changed the way people saw the church and these sorts of things. It's important to remember that this video is just a really overview. There's far more detail in the actual in the iBook, and you need to be relying on the information from the iBook. This is to get you thinking about that information and get a bit of an understanding about it. So, as I just mentioned before, he was assigned to the role as a caretaker or traditional pope. He was elected as a traditional pope, and he wasn't expected to live particularly long, and he didn't have a particularly long papacy anyway. But what's surprising is that in the 4 years of his papacy, he had a massive impact on the papacy and on the world as a whole. So he brought the church back to the core ideals of the apostles in the early church, which they'd learned from Jesus. So he goes back to what Jesus was intending and what Jesus was teaching us, and using that as the model for his life and his papacy. And he also stressed that the clergy and the laity were partners in carrying out the mission of the church. So what he did was he revised a lot of the things in the church and modernised the church to include the laity a lot more, rather than the priests being the sort of the sole focus of the church. The laity had a much broader role and a much greater role in the church as we know it today, and it wasn't the case prior to his papacy. So he also revolutionised the church. He humanised the role of the Pope. He's involved in ecumenism and interfaith dialogue. He involved the church in world affairs, and he modernised the church. There's a term called aggiornamento, which means modernising, and he was a believer in this idea of aggiornamento, where they would modernise the church to become something a little bit, keeping up with the times and progressing the church into a new direction for a new age. And that came through with the instigation of Vatican II. Now, one thing with the instigation of the Vatican II, when we get up to this point, is that we need to remember that the instigation of Vatican II is he instigated it, but he was not there for the entire proceedings of Vatican II. So we can't give him credit for a lot of things. Some things we can, but for a lot of the changes that came about as a result of Vatican II, we can't directly attribute Pope John the 23rd to those changes. So essentially, they're the four areas that we look at when we're analysing the impact of Pope John the 23rd. And the first one that we'll have a look at is humanising the role of the Pope, and then we'll look at some examples from some of those other ones, which will be in separate videos. But first we'll have a look at the humanising of the role of the Pope. So we've got here an image on the right-hand side, and this is of Pope John when he was visiting some people at a prison. Now, he visited Sikkim, and there's a lot of details on this in your in the iBook, and you must know them. You must know the dates, you must know the names of the prisons, you must know the names of the people. That's all very important in terms of adding depth to your argument, and that's what's going to get you the high marks for studies of religion in the exam. So he brought a pastoral emphasis into his position, visiting sick prisoners on significant days like Christmas Eve, and the lay people could relate to the Pope. So popes hadn't done this before, but this is on the right-hand side. This is a prison in Rome, and he went and visited a whole bunch of prisoners who were there and said Mass for the prisoners. And he actually said to them, "You couldn't come to me, so I came to you," which is a pretty significant quote of his. And the next day, that was on Christmas Eve, and on Christmas Day he went and visited sick children in a Bambino Gesù hospital, and he also visited another hospital at another time too. So this is a pretty significant thing for the Pope to actually come to these sick people, which is modelling himself off Christ and the impact of Christ. And what he did was he sort of revived, I suppose, Christians' view of the church and people's view of the church through actions like this. Another quote he had was he tried to encourage people to become, to pursue a religious order, to boost the numbers of the priests, I suppose, and to encourage people to their vocation. And he said, "Anyone can be a pope. The proof of this is that I have become one." So he's another impact he had was encouraging men to come into the priesthood and encouraging people to restore their faith in the church. And because of the fact that this Pope would go and visit people who were unwell or who were imprisoned and didn't shun them, people felt that they had a really close personal relationship with the Pope. So he sort of became a bit of a father figure in the whole Christian world. And he was a popular figure in the late 50s and early 1960s, and that's where we come to see him as the People's Pope, because he reached out to people, saying Mass to the prisoners, and visiting the sick people, in particular children with polio, which is contagious, and so at sort of personal risk, he went and visited these children regardless, and that sort of showed that he was modelling himself off Christ. So we've also got just the way he presented himself, his personal warmth. He had a good sense of humour, and he was very kind, and that captured the world's affections and their attention. No other pope prior to Pope John had this sort of relationship with the public the way that he did. And the impact of that was that people sort of saw the church as something a little bit more real and a little bit more tangible, and something that they could relate to and associate with. And one sort of example of one of the things that he did do is that one of his first acts was to improve the wages and the social standing and the social conditions of Vatican employees. So he wanted to look after those people around him, and that was a notion that sort of spread throughout his whole papacy. As we go through.